we've gotten a lot of emails about is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And we've been hesitant to talk about it because there isn't a lot of information out there about it. So just to tell you what we do know through leaked information, the United States is partnering up with countries including Australia, Canada, and Japan. And they're signing something that's kind of hidden under a free trade agreement. And basically, under this free trade agreement, there would be a section that would pass this law that would help protect companies from copyright infringement. And it's very similar to what we've heard when it comes to SOPA. Here's one thing that's very, very clear about this. These governments are being very, very quiet about it, and everything is on the down low. So that in and of itself makes me realize that something sketchy is going on. All the information that we do know has been leaked to us, and there are several tech websites that are writing about it. Just to give you a little more broad information about it, under the Trans-Pacific Partnership, 3-strike policies and laws that require internet intermediaries to terminate their users' internet access on repeat allegations of copyright infringement. Seems very similar to SOPA. Requirements for internet intermediaries to filter all internet communications for potentially copyright infringing material. Again, very similar to SOPA. And finally, ISP obligations to block access to websites that allegedly infringe or facilitate copyright infringement. And there's one more actually. Efforts to force intermediaries to disclose the identities of their customers to IP rights holders on an allegation of copyright infringement. Again, all of this sounds very, very similar to SOPA, and I knew that this would happen. By the way, they're trying to pass these laws under a free trade agreement. There's hardly any free trade obstacles between the United States and the countries that I listed earlier, Canada, Japan, Australia. There are no barriers. Or if there are barriers, there are very few barriers. So the fact that they're doing this under a free trade agreement is also very sketchy.
Yeah, especially because some of the provisions would enable, like for example, the pharmaceutical industries to have longer copyright protections on some of their drugs. There are things specifically in this that are the exact opposite of free trade. They're actually increasing the amount of regulation over the transfer of products and technology and things like that. But as the greatest coverage of this that I've found so far was in The Guardian, and they made clear that they believe that the reason that the new version of some of the elements of SOPA are being encapsulated under this new package is because when something is labeled as free trade, it's very difficult, especially in America, to come out in opposition to it because you don't want to seem to be a protectionist or anything like that. And so they're going to be able to encapsulate these new copyright infringement provisions under a much bigger package deal that, I mean, we're going to focus more on that part because we're scared about the possibility of greater regulation of materials on the internet. But there are a ton of different scary things in here. Like I said about the pharmaceutical industries, the fact that their copyrights could be protected for up to 14 years is something that they've been pushing for a long time.
And keep in mind what that means for you as the consumer, right? They want to prevent generic versions of their drugs from going on the market, and the generic versions are the versions that most Americans can afford. So that obviously is going to have a negative impact on you. But the part of this that I'm most worried about is, when you look at the elements of this agreement, they are very similar to SOPA. And what does that mean for websites like Google or, search engines like Google? What does it mean for Facebook? Does that mean that somebody posts a link that contains copyrighted material and that website has to shut down your page? Do you get banned from the internet as specified in what I was mentioning before? Those are all very problematic. And I feel like the worst part about this is there was a little bit more transparency with SOPA. So we were able to fight against it. But in this case, since it's so under wraps and people are kind of unaware of it, it's under the radar, I feel like they're going to have a much easier time passing this type of thing.
I think that they will have an easier time. I don't know that in the end they'll be able to get it passed. Now, you shouldn't be too scared about the fact that we don't have a ton of details about it. That sounds conspiratorial and kind of scary, but these are multilateral negotiations going on, and countries aren't supposed to be leaking too much information. But the fact that, as The Guardian points out, top executives at General Electric, Goldman Sachs, Pfizer, other companies like this very likely do have much more information about this deal than the members of relevant congressional committees. That's a little bit scarier. But I would say that while we have a problem, especially because we pay so much attention to politics, it depresses us sometimes that most people don't, and these things happen that affect them and they don't know about it. This is the one area where I think that the internet, and particularly communities on Reddit, have been the best at informing people about and mobilizing them in opposition to SOPA, for instance. And so I would imagine that if people aren't too distracted by the RNC and the DNC, that this will actually get a lot of coverage, at least on the internet, and you might see some pushback before it moves too far towards being a completed agreement.
I definitely see this as something that will be on Reddit's radar. I read about this on Boing Boing, which is kind of like a strange, but honestly, like it's an unconventional source of media, right? It's not something that you hear about in the mainstream, but that's kind of it kind of goes to show my point that when it comes to this kind of news that has to do with your rights on the internet, you usually get it from like these fringe websites. And I'm not saying Boing Boing is a fringe website, but you get what I'm saying. It's not a mainstream, it's not like abcnews.com or some msnbc.com or anything like that. Another thing that I wanted to make sure you guys were aware of is there's absolutely no sign of due process. So if you are accused of linking to or including copyrighted material on your website, they can just shut it down without any due process. And that's another huge issue with this, very similar to what we saw with SOPA.
And just two last final points. One of the scariest things about this is that while it would be very difficult to pass something like SOPA again, now that it's on people's radar, trade negotiations like this are particularly problematic because they can force Congress to comply with the trade negotiations. And so this circumvents going through Congress. But finally, I think it's interesting that once again we might end up having to rely on WikiLeaks. So Just Foreign Policy is offering a reward that's currently at least at $21,000 to anybody who can get a copy to WikiLeaks for distribution, which I think is exciting.